Welcome again, everyone, to the Drought Gardening Tips webinar hosted this afternoon by the Sonoma County Master Gardeners. I think it is a action-packed, information-filled afternoon, so thank you for joining. My name is Kim Roberts, and I'll serve as moderator today. A couple of tips as we get going, or a couple of just housekeeping items. One is this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up link sent to your email address with the information to be able to log on again through YouTube. Not only will this webinar be on our YouTube channel, there are also a lot of other resources that you'll hear some reference to as we move along. We'll also send you a list of the resources that are cited, the websites, articles, etc. Again, there's a lot of information being shared this afternoon. Don't feel like you need to take a bunch of notes. That information will once again be sent to you. Please come up with lots and lots of questions. Not only do you get to hear from these experts, but they'll also be available for you to answer any questions that you might have. So be thinking about questions and put them in the Q&A box, and we'll plan on answering those at the end. And we'll do that through our panelists. Will come on and join me and work through the questions. If we do run out of time, we can also follow up with any remaining questions through email. So with that, let's get started. Our first speaker this afternoon is Cleo Tarazi. Cleo was born and raised in Alexandria, Virginia, or Alexandria, Egypt, wrong country, to a Greek family. She immigrated to California in the 1960s. After retiring as an urban planner and living in cities, she moved to Santa Rosa. She joined Master Gardeners in 2016. As a Master Gardener, Cleo has enjoyed working the Farmers Market, Firewise and Fire Safe Landscape Task Force, the Climate Change Task Force, Fund Development, social media, and she now serves as our president of Master Gardeners. Having to learn from scratch all aspects of gardening has been, as she characterizes it, a struggle, but sharing the knowledge with Sonoma community is now a commitment and a joy. And she says, we live in times where each gardener can truly make a difference. So thank you, Cleo.
Thank you, Kim. Just to make sure, Kim, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. I want to thank Kim for serving as our moderator. Kim is one of our Master Gardeners from the class of 2020, and I wanted to let everyone know that right now, Master Gardener Program of Sonoma County is taking applications for the class of 2022. So you can find our link on our webpage and sign up if you are so interested in doing the work that we do with us. So here we are. Today we are going to be, our webinar will have 3 sections. The first section will be managing the landscape plants in a drought. Our second section will be planting and planning winter food garden. And final section will be fire resilient landscaping. So I want to be honest, and we're all going to be honest with each other, that in the last few years, gardening has been a challenge. It used to be that we could just, with our personal aesthetics and our traditions, we can sort of figure out what we wanted to put in our garden and where to go. But considering all the climatic changes in the last few years, we have had to make some major adjustments. Our mission as UC Master Gardeners of Sonoma County is to provide horticultural education and information that is science-based on sustainable gardening. In light of these conditions, we have been readjusting our programs and public education to focus on how Sonoma County gardeners would adjust to the climatic changes. Each year we face new challenges and we get tested. So let me start by saying that there is an authority that maybe a lot of us don't know called the Regional Climatic Protection Agency of Sonoma County.
Leo, oh, there you go. Sorry, go ahead.
And this agency, I'm sorry, I didn't advance it. This agency has done some of the work for us about some of the things that we have been experiencing, and they've addressed what are the climatic challenges in Sonoma County. Hotter, drier weather, with longer summers, check. More extreme heat events, check. Longer and more frequent droughts, there's another one. Greater frequency and intensity of wildfires, double check. Fewer winter nights that freeze and more variable rain. Bigger and more variable floods. Well, what does that mean to us as gardeners? Well, what's been happening with the rising temperatures that we have seen, the USDA plant hardiness zones, which tell us what we can plant and where and when, have been migrating. Coastal fog, an important source of summer moisture, is less frequent. And we all know, I mean, we missed the fog, even though we all complained about it. Plants might not get adequate rest in the dormant season. Fruit and nut trees may not get the chill hours they need for successful fruiting. Winter warm spells can encourage plants to leaf or bud out and to be struck before spring arrives. Plants lose moisture faster, which is something that is very dangerous for our fire season. Extreme rainfall in the Bay Area has become in the form of atmospheric rivers, which cause intense and damaging extreme effects like extreme runoff, mudslides, and waterlogged roots. I lost a couple of Meyer lemons when we had the atmospheric rivers. California droughts will likely be longer and deeper. This drought came faster than the last drought was here. This will be true even if average rainfall does not change. We will have long dry periods, will increase plant flammability, and dry vegetation can start the wildfires. As home gardeners, what are our choices? Do we go on doing what we did? That's not most likely going to work. Do we stop gardening? I don't think if any one of you who's here is ready to stop gardening. Or do we adjust with the outlook of what's coming in mind? So what does adjusting mean? Adjusting means that we accept that our summers are going to be drier and that we live in a summer dry climate. We have to reconsider what we plant and what we don't plant. We adjust when we plant. We focus on our soil. We minimize the use of fertilizers and herbicides and retain water in our property. We commit to encouraging wildlife habitat in our garden. Those are the key sustainable gardening principles that the UC Master Gardener program encourages. So how do we get this information on how to do all these things? Well, we seek out for reliable information. Seek out science-based information with climate change in mind. And that's what we try to do in the UC Master Gardener program. We keep in mind also that this information will change as we get more research and as events change. Science, as we have recently learned, is not static. It changes and we need to adapt to it. But then how do we incorporate this complexity into our gardening, our lives, and our resources? We take small steps and build on our knowledge that we accumulate. We maybe lower our expectations from the past. Maybe that lovely maybe that lovely plant that we had in the front of our window is not going to thrive anymore. Or maybe that's not the right place for that plant to be because of Firewise gardening. We create new expectations. We readjust our aesthetic and our tastes. But most of all, we join others in our community in these efforts and learn from each other. This is a continuous learning experience. So with that, I will give it back to Kim to introduce Mary Lou.
Great. Thank you so much, Cleo. A very important context and introduction. As Cleo mentioned, the next section will be on landscape planting. And our speaker this afternoon is Mary Lou Milkoff. Born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, Mary Lou is a true California native. She learned to appreciate the art of gardening because her parents strove to make their home garden a beautiful, welcoming space for wildlife as well as humans. Moving to Santa Rosa in the late 1960s, she was busy raising 2 children and earning her secondary teaching credential. Landing a job with Santa Rosa City Schools, she went on to teach English, world history, humanities, and journalism during her 30-year tenure, achieving national board status before retiring. Always eager to learn something new and continue to serve her community, the Sonoma Master Gardeners Program is a perfect fit, teaching and gardening. Thank you, Mary Lou.
Well, thank you, Kim. Welcome everyone to today's first presentation, Managing Landscape Plants in a Drought. Topics we're going to discuss: water conservation. Cleo already explained a lot of that to you. We're going to learn some watering resources that are available to the public. We're going to understand what our plant water needs are and prioritize our garden plants with that need in mind. Soils and irrigation strategies and other water conserving methods. Our resources and links, as Kim said, will be mailed to you. All right, our planet, our planet is a closed water system. We must strive for sustainability. We can't expect water to be replenished from outer space. Next slide. There are only 3 ways to save water in a landscape. You have to know and reduce the site water requirement, namely the type and number of plants in your garden. Make these summer dry, climate appropriate. And I probably will say that term a lot. Increase your irrigation efficiency with appropriate irrigation choices. Like drip is 95 efficient, while spray or rotor sprinklers are only 40 to 70% efficient. And management. Pay close attention to what is happening in your landscape. Manage your plants in irrigation. Much landscape water is misapplied and needlessly lost. Next slide. Yes, we all have to budget. Do you know how much water you use per day? Historical data from Sonoma Water shows its residential customers use an average of 75 gallons per day per person for inside and outside water needs. Typically, homeowners will use 50% for outdoor use. All California water users have been asked to cut back by 20%. And many districts have upped that percentage, such as Cloverdale at 25 and Healdsburg at 40. Sonoma County water districts, in Sonoma County water districts, outside watering is allowed only on certain days of the week or times of day and night. Check your water supplier for all restrictions. Next slide. You can use your water meter to help track water usage and detect leaks. Note that 1 cubic foot equals 7.48 gallons of water. Monitor your water bills, note spikes in usage, check your meter. Make sure no water is running inside or outside the house when you check. Now, Santa Rosa water customers can register for a service that will allow them to check their usage online by the hour, the day, the week, with a 24-hour delay. I believe Valley of the Moon Water District offers much the same service. Please check with your supplier. No help from your water supplier? Well, there's an app for that. Flumewater.com, that's F-L-U-M-E water.com, will sell you a smartphone app and a water meter sensor for about $200. Healdsburg rebates $100 of the cost for its water customers. The app does not work for well users. They can have a flow meter installed, and there are between 35 and 40,000 wells in Sonoma County. That's a lot of water. Next slide. Oh, how do we garden? In our climate, with unreliable rainfall and our desire to grow crops and have landscapes, we have to irrigate. Best that we do so thoughtfully and choose plants that suit our Mediterranean summer dry climate. Know the names and growth habits of all your plants. I know that may seem like a daunting task, but a worthwhile one. If you don't know some of them, try one of the many plant ID apps that are available for smartphones, or take pictures and show them to a local nursery person. Recent and current wildfires remind us that we also need to keep fire risks in mind as we design and manage our landscapes. Follow CAL FIRE's zone requirements around the outside of your home. And Mimi will talk more about this subject. Next slide. To conserve water, we need to talk about plant water needs. There are two components to consider: evaporation from soil and plant surfaces, and transpiration from plants themselves. Climate change results in higher temperatures, drier soil, and an increase in transpiration, all of which result in higher plant water needs. How can home gardeners know what the ET, or evapotranspiration rate, is on a given day to learn how much water was lost out of the soil and needs to be replenished? Next slide. Home gardeners can find historical evapotranspiration information on the CIMIS website, an acronym that stands for California Management Information, Irrigation Management Information System, much better saying CIMIS. It was established about 30 years ago to help commercial growers calculate watering needs. CIMIS is a program in the California Department of Water Resources that manages a network of 145 automated weather stations. 4 of its weather stations are in Sonoma County, 2 in Santa Rosa, 1 west in the Laguna and east in Bennett Valley, I think at the golf course, and 1 each in Petaluma and Windsor. CIMIS supplies the data used by other agencies to determine when to irrigate and how much water to apply. I have included a link to a UC article that explains ETO in more detail if you wish to take a deeper dive. That's on our link page. Next slide. This chart, the CIMIS chart, shows station 83, which is the Laguna station, between 1990 and 2015. It provides an example of average historical rain ETO and precipitation by month for CIMIS station 83. Since then, climate change has only decreased precipitation and increased our watering needs. ETO, what does that mean? Well, we know evapotranspiration. What's the little O about? The little O refers to a standard in California, a surface of well-maintained cool season turf grass like bluegrass or ryegrass, a lawn. That reference evapotranspiration rate is calculated by CIMIS as written at ET with a little O. If we were measuring an alfalfa field, it would be ET with a little R. That's all that is. It peaks in July when our rainfall, our water reserves are the lowest, and when our plants are growing. This means we need to irrigate. The formula to calculate the gallons of irrigation water needed per day will be again on my link page. Next slide. This slide, very interesting one, shows a chart of weekly ETO written in inches of water for the months of March to October. That's the gray craggy line. Now that's what needed to be replenished from the soil. The orange straight across, up and across line is what the typical residential irrigation pattern is. So the yellow area represents under irrigation, and the blue represents over irrigation. This pattern exemplifies the set it and forget it approach to using your irrigation controller until a heat wave in June or a rain or cold event in November. The goal of the water manager is to match the irrigation to the ETO gray line. But our typical landscape shrubs, perennials, and trees do not need as much water as a well-watered lawn, the reference number. So how do we know how much to water them? Next slide. Many typical and popular plants in other parts of the country are high water use plants here. Lawns, annuals such as petunias, zinnias, annual vegetables, birch and willow trees. Redwoods also fit here because they're really a coastal plant and rely on fog for a lot of their water needs. Moderate water use plants require about half the amount of water. These include roses, vines, perennials, shrubs, and fruit trees. Our California native plants and those from Mediterranean climates around the world, such as Australia, South Africa, Chile, are generally in the low or very low categories and need a quarter of the water high need plants demand. Many of our Dudleya, our native succulent, Epilobium, California fuchsia, Achilles, yarrow, Garrya elliptica, the coast silk tassel shrub, and our native Dudleya. Yeah, I already said that, sorry. We need to know the plant factor, high, medium, low, very low for all our plants and create a list of our plants accordingly. Next slide. To help us know the water needs of our established plants and to choose appropriate plants for our landscape, we can use this resource. Again, the acronym, Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. You can download this database and find Region 1, that's us. Plants are alphabetized by their botanical names. WCOLS was developed for landscape professionals by UC Davis to use as a guide to the water needs of landscape plants. Next slide. WCOLS categories, high, moderate, I say medium, low, and very low. The WCOLS categories are based on a particular region's historical evapotranspiration rates, sourced from CIMMYS data. High water use plants require 70 to 90% of that lawn reference number, that ETO rate. Down to very low water use that requires less than 10. So you can see it's a dramatic difference. Next slide. And here you really see the dramatic difference. The black line are the high water use plants, and the white line, the moderate or medium water use plants, with the next one being low and very low. Next slide. No matter where you live in the county, amid many microclimates in Sonoma County, check out Water Smart Yard, a useful tool by the city of Santa Rosa, weekly giving water recommendations during watering season. Even if you are not a Santa Rosa resident, you can tweak the numbers to accommodate your specific site. Water requirements are probably a bit higher for Sonoma, Cloverdale, and probably a bit lower for parts of Petaluma and near the coast. But this site gives you a really good start, gives you a heads up about the changing needs of watering. Here are the recommendations for a week in October of 2019. Note the amount of required water is only 60% of the highest watering month, July. The Water Smart site will give you the 100% reference numbers to plug into your irrigation controller. There are recommendations for lawns, as well as low and moderate use plants and trees. Let's look at the drip recommendations. 18 minutes per week for low water use plants, watered once per week. Twice that amount for moderate water use plants on drip. By the way, this week's watering recommendation calls for 94% of that 100% mid-July reference point. New information for this site is published every Thursday. Next slide.
Mary Lou, 5 minutes.
If you have a central controller, central controllers have improved over the years to help home gardeners water more efficiently. Hydrozoning is grouping the same water use plants on the same valve, such as a valve just for trees, for medium water use plants, one for pots. Adjusting an established system is more complicated than starting with a new system. Think about replacing your controller if it's over 10 years old, because there are new features like multiple start times and a space for rain or weather sensors, seasonal adjustment percentages. Next slide. These values fluctuate as new SIMS data is added to create long-term averages. They show another example of why the set it and forget it method of programming a controller causes water loss. The information here is the SIMS average from 1990 to 2019. Next slide. It's important to know what type of soil you have because that determines how often and how long you water. Next slide. Infiltration, the downward movement of water in the soil, and percolation, the flow through the soil. Soils dominated by sand are considered light and have rapid infiltration and percolation rates. Water goes straight down through sandy soil when compared with loam and clay. Loam is considered ideal for horticultural purposes, and the rate at which water infiltrates and percolates is between the rates of sand and heavy clay. Soil dominated by clay is considered heavy and has slower information and percolation rates than sandy or loam soils. The water spreads out further. It also holds the water in the soil longer. The image shows the different wetted patterns produced by 1 gallon per hour drippers in the 3 different types of soil. Next slide. Watering plants in clay soil by hand can have deceptive results. We know that sandy soil is frequent irrigation with short run times because it goes down fast, but clay soil, we need infrequent irrigation with longer cycled run times to increase infiltration depth. Clay soil cannot absorb water as fast as sprinklers, and some drip apply it. So instead of setting your schedule to water 1 long cycle per night, set it to water 2 or 3 shorter cycles. This will allow the water to soak in and encourage deeper roots. If you have clay soil, it may be useful to have 1/2 gallon per hour drippers so that it doesn't overwhelm the soil. Next slide. Here's the rooting depth of plants, just to show you that they don't go down as far as you might think they do, and that trees are really the thing we have to think the most about. Understanding the root depth is important to help us understand how deep we should water. Like plant oxygen should be 20 to 30% of the soil, but it's only in the top 18 inches. Most of the action is the top 3 feet. We may not need to irrigate as long as we think. Next slide. Keep emitters away from the stem or trunk and grow your irrigation as your plants grow. This is the most common problem I see in the gardens I visit, is that the irrigation gets set and it is never moved to accommodate the growth of the plants. Make sure that that's a management thing you can do. Next slide. Prioritize your plants. Now that you know, say you have done the work to identify all your plants, you know each one's growth habits, and perhaps you have consulted wool coals as to water needs. Prioritize the plants accordingly to their water needs, high, medium, low, very low, and the value they bring to you and your garden versus the amount of water they use. Give trees the highest priority. Trees are the most costly thing we have in our landscape. They take the longest to grow and they provide cooling shade. Spacious lawns are unsustainable in our summer dry climate. consider reducing or removing your lawn area. At least cut back the water to it this summer. Sometimes trade-offs are appropriate. Forego a flowering annual bed in favor of growing a few vegetables your family can use. Next slide. Irrigate trees to the canopy or drip line, because you can see from this slide on the left that it may even go further. If the tree is over your house, it is under your house. Use the inline emitter tubing if you have a controller in a circle, and then adjust it as the tree grows. Very important. Next slide. You can also water with a soaker hose. They come in various lengths and screw into a faucet or garden hose. You may lose pressure the longer the line, so be careful with that, not over 50 feet. And also, when you're hand watering, if you're not using a soaker hose, hand watering works well too. Anytime you're hand watering, you're watching what you're doing, which makes the process very efficient compared to automatic systems that come on before you're likely awake and alert to what's really happening. A garden hose water meter, as that little green thing is on my right, will track how much water you use. You need a pressure regulator if you're using soaker hose, because the water coming in to the soaker hose in those little tiny holes will overwhelm them. You need to bring the pressure down to about 30 psi. And next slide. Think about reducing your plantings. Now you know your plant water use rates from WUCOLs, and you can open up overcrowded or overgrown garden beds. That woody lavender, low water use, needs to go. If you are using drip emitters and have removed the plants they have been watering, remove the emitters and place a goof plug in the empty dripper hole. Keep the 5 to 30 zone around your house clean, lean, and green. Add space between plants. Clean up any dead leaves. Just enough water to keep the remaining plants healthy, because weak plants invite pests and disease. Remove any turf within the canopy of trees. Trees need infrequent, deep watering, the opposite of lawns. Next slide. Some of the plants you want to keep show signs of stress. Wilting or drooping leaves, upward curling, rolling, yellowing, dropping. New growth is stunted. Check plants frequently for signs of drought. Plants need to be watered before irreversible damage occurs. The best time, 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Next slide. Next slide. Plant in the fall. Hold off planting until the fall, where we might have cooler temperatures and we might get some rain. All new plants require steady moisture for 1 to 2 years. So if you couldn't stand it and you planted plants already, then make sure you water them extra. Add 2 to 3 inches of organic compost to your beds to hold the moisture in the soil, keeping it 6 inches away from stems. In the 5 to 30 zone, be aware that wood mulches burn. Next slide. Build healthy living soil, because it is living. It's full of microorganisms, an ecosystem that creates a symbiosis between plant roots and soil organisms. Compost is all you need as fertilizer. Don't till, don't use weed cloth, as that will break that symbiosis and it will kill the microorganisms. Keep off the land as much as you can to avoid soil compaction and loss of air. Next. Anyone want to remove a lawn? We advise waiting until fall before sheet mulching, putting down flammable cardboard and adding wood mulch. Maybe a little rain will come and you can do it then. Now we ask you to put compost on top of it, of the soil, and download our How to Remove a Lawn brochure, again on our links. Next slide. This swale at the Sutter Hospital parking lot on Marquez Springs Road was created to collect parking lot runoff, keep the water on the property, and clean out the pollutants as the water sinks into the ground. Slow it, spread it, sink it. sustainability. Next slide. There are other ways that you can keep water on the property using permeable paving. And maybe you do have a spot for a rain garden somewhere, a low spot in your landscape, or a dry creek bed. Replenishing the groundwater supply is extremely important for sustainability. And the summary next. Water is precious and needs to be conserved. We are planting for our climate with the right plant in the right place. We know each plant's water needs. We use hydrozones, same water needs plants in the same areas. Use Firewise strategies, irrigate according to your soil type, and irrigate efficiently with drip. Keep water on the landscape. And thank you very much. Back to Kim. Links will be available.
Great, thank you so much, Mary Lou. Yes, as Mary Lou just commented, we will provide links to all of these resources as well. Again, the presentation will be posted on YouTube. So, because it's pretty jam-packed in terms of information we're providing to you this afternoon. Also, one other mention, we will take a very brief break after our next two speakers who are going to talk with us about landscape or gardening in a drought. So with that, I want to introduce Kathy McFan and Kitty Ritz. Kathy has been a Sonoma County Master Gardener since 2016. She has been actively involved in the Master Gardener Food Gardening Specialist Program, the Bayer Farm Project, and the Master Gardener Climate Change Task Force. She has been growing organic food gardens since 1972. Over the last 34 years, she and her husband, Paul, have developed a Sebastopol property that was primarily a sheep pasture into an orchard of 36 fruit trees, berries, vegetable beds, and a mix of perennial plants, flowers, and increasingly native plants. They have seen the climate change significantly over these years. Kitty joined Master Gardeners after retiring from educating children and adults. She volunteered as the garden teacher at the elementary school, where she worked to bring children into the natural world and encourage healthy eating. As a food gardening specialist, she collaborated with the team at Bayer Farm Community Garden. Her urban garden has changed over the years with a focus on veggies, berries, and pollinators. Welcome, Kathy and Kitty.
So thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to start off talking, and then Kitty will step in partway through. First of all, I didn't mention in the bio that my background was in mental health, and I'm aware as we do this presentation that this is hard for all of us. This is challenging for gardeners to adapt to the drought, to see our plants under stress, and to make changes in things that we might be quite attached to in terms of gardening. So thank you all for being here, and congratulations for stepping in and trying to adapt. We're all sharing a time of, we talk about climate change. The UN report that came out, I think yesterday or today, talks about a climate crisis. So let's acknowledge with each other that this is a tough thing, and we're all adjusting to a hotter and in California, a drier climate with more intermittent and sometimes, as Cleo said, rather dramatic rain events. So we all within that live in slightly different environments. As Mary Lou mentioned, we have a lot of different microclimates here in Sonoma County. So that when we're talking about strategies and things that you can do, we're all going to need to adapt in a general way to a hotter, drier climate, but each of our individual situations will vary. Some people are on really dramatic water rationing at this point and really not even able to consider using irrigation systems in their gardens. So may not apply to you when we talk about using a drip system right now. In terms of you using that at this point. So some of us have wells. We're needing to look at our well flow, and we're measuring how far down the water is and how much flow we're continuing to get. We're worried about losing our water source. So all of us are having to address this, but each of our situation is different. And when we talk about adaptations for a drier climate and a hotter climate, and we're talking about adaptations for fire, again, it can be overwhelming at times. I look at our property, as I've said, we're pretty heavily planted, and I think I will try prayer as a partial strategy for dealing with fire, because we've begun to make adaptations. We've cut back some trees. We've moved some things away from our foundation, but in truth, we have a lot of plant material here. So how to make those changes, how to make those choices, and what the priorities are going to be different for each of you, but the information you get here can be valuable and quite useful. So I am my primary controller for my irrigation system here. And so it means that we use a lot of hand watering, and then our vegetable beds are all on drip, but they're on a manual time drip, so that I go around and I use a very high-tech strategy for evaluating the dryness, which is I put my finger in the soil and kind of feel around. And we'll be talking about different ways for evaluating how much water you need. I want to emphasize the importance, just before we move into the specifics, of what Mary Lou talked about soil. When we moved into this property 32 years ago, when it would rain, we would have water spouts coming out of the gopher holes, because basically this is sandy, permeable soil out here in Sebastopol. The water would run down, they'd find the gopher holes, and we would have little streams and water fountains coming out the property. Over the last 20 years, we've highly emphasized using compost, cover crops, and mulch. And I cannot emphasize the difference that has made. We have 36 fruit trees. None of them are irrigated at this point. When we put them in, they were irrigated the first years, but we really changed the constitution of our soil over a long period of time, so that it now acts as really a sponge for the water. It holds and retains it. There's a lot of information about using this kind of strategy of the compost, cover crops, and mulch. Some of it's available through the Master Gardener site. And I really encourage you to consider this as a long-term strategy, because we're talking about a drought, but we're talking about a change in climate, and we need to do what we can to help the gardens adapt. So we're all making choices, and we're all making adaptations. I certainly have done that. I just pulled out all our 8 blueberry plants, because I really decided that in terms of the demands of the plants, in terms of watering, it's a very high water need plant, and it is sensitive to the heat. The place I had it was challenging for the plants, and I just have to look at sustainability in terms of our water, our resources, and my time and energy. And so I gave them away. Other people have them, and I spread them around, and other people will be growing blueberries. So we've moved out hydrangeas and substitute manzanitas. And I'm sure all of you are trying to look at those kinds of strategies about how can you really create a sustainable garden system in a changed and dramatically changing environment. So given all that, let's go to the next slide. We're going to be talking about growing a fall winter garden. A lot of people don't do that in terms of gardening. Many people grow just a summer garden. But think about it. If you can get your garden started with vegetables, here's the advantage. Come the winter rains, which I know we're all praying for, you have a great deal of support with watering your garden, and you can get by with watering very, very little, if at all, during a good rain season throughout the fall and winter. The challenge, of course, is getting that garden started. So specifically, you're going to need to look at the water restrictions in your area, know how many gallons you have in your total budget, and know that on average, a 4x8 bed requires about 20 gallons of water a week. That will vary depending on, as Mary Lou said, the length of the day, the heat, a number of different factors, the kind of soil that you have. But that's an average. Next slide. So here's a formula. And again, this material will be available to you afterwards. So you can go back and look at this formula to kind of estimate, given your budget, how much you want to dedicate to a edible vegetable garden. So the average is 0.623 gallons per week is needed for each square foot, and an 8x4 bed, 32 square feet, 20 gallons a week. So that's the estimation. You can look at, you can plug your numbers into that formula if you want. Okay, next slide. So if you choose to plant a winter garden, you can, what we're calling a cool season garden, you can make choices a little beyond yes or no about planting a garden. You can reduce the size of your planting and you can grow fewer vegetables. I am painfully, when my summer garden plants began to look a little tired, I am cutting them off at the base, leaving the roots in the soil, covering them right now with compost and with mulch, and that come October, I will plant cover crop seeds in them. And really, as I said, again, I guess I'm repeating myself, pray for the rain to come. But I'm really, really limiting the winter garden that I'm planting because I've got to get it started during this hot, dry season. So next slide. So as we said, you've planted a summer garden. It's right now, it's looking pretty great. Those tomatoes are producing the peppers. You can choose to let it go fallow, but we are going to be talking about if you let it go fallow, that you don't just let it sit there. No naked soil, compost and mulch at least, and cover crops. We will have materials about that coming out in October, and really, really encourage you to consider that. The research is really good on how cover crops can help your vegetable beds. So next slide. So if you're going to plant a fall garden, here are some things to consider. Now's the time to be thinking about it. It's hard because it's hot and it's summer and you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to be growing things in October, November, December. Why would I do that now? Well, because the seeds that you're planting, as the days get shorter, they're going to take a little longer to really get started and get going. So those carrot seeds you planted in the spring will take a little longer to start now. Also, you want to think about the days to maturity for the varieties that you choose. Maybe you're going to think about shorter days to maturity because within each vegetable, kind of vegetable, and there are varieties of vegetables that are faster growing and faster to come to maturity. And then there are some that are slower. Next slide. So days to maturity are the average days that a plant needs to get to maturity in the first harvest. So you can see here on the seed packet, the lettuce butter crunch, you can see, there you go, 65 days to maturity. You will find as you look at different lettuce seeds, just the lettuce seeds, that there will be a great deal of variability on how long it takes to be able to get a crop of those vegetables. So you can, same thing on when you plant starts, and you'll look and you'll see on your broccoli start, or here's a baby beet start, that it says 40 days. So that's 40 days after you put that transplant out. So seeds are a little different than the plant starts, but the advantage of putting out the plants is that part of the water need has been taken care of for your plant. There are some plants that are notoriously challenging to plant from starts. I'm not sure carrots are worth it. Beets are questionable, but some things like broccoli and lettuce and the greens, if you plant them out with starts, you've got the advantage of having somebody else help water those to that growth point. Consider having your crops near maturity by November 18th. So why is that? Well, that's when the daylight slips between 10 hours a day, and it's what we call the Persephone period. For those of you who know the myth, if you don't, read it and you'll catch why that's used as a description of the time that the plants really go dormant. And there's just not enough light for them to really grow, so they kind of sit there and wait until spring starts. Next slide. So look at the variation on how many days there are to maturity in the same kind of plant. So broccoli, 40 to 80 days. There are, in fact, broccoli varieties that are much longer, and some of those, and this gets a little tricky, can overwinter. So you could have a broccoli plant that had 120 days to maturity, some of the sprouting broccolis, and it kind of gets to a good size, and then it sits and waits. And then in spring, it will surprise you with some sprouts. Same thing with carrots. Look at that, 50 to 90 days. Maybe now's the time to plant that 50-day to maturity carrot, not the 90-day. Okay, next slide. So you'll hear the term half-hardy and hardy crops. So there are some crops like lettuce and cauliflower, some of the other tender Asian greens, for example, which need to be mature before the first frost date. You really need to expect to be eating them, and they can be damaged by frost. There are ways to manage that, which Kitty will talk about later, but they're frost tender. There are crops like kale and broccoli, which need to be close to maturity before frost, but they don't need to be fully mature. They're happy with a little frost, and in fact, some people say that helps them taste a little better. So if you've got the kale plants, you don't like it, maybe if it's frost touched, you'll like it better. Okay, next slide. So what can you plant in your fall garden? Well, really quite a bit. All of these plants, basically brassicas, which are your cauliflower, your kale, your broccolis, all of those can be planted. What are called alliums, and we don't have those listed, but green onions, why not plant some green onions, some spring onions? Those are great to have in your winter garden, and they grow rather easily. They don't take a lot of space. Many of the root crops, with the exception of potatoes, which are technically, we think of them as a root. They're not actually, they're a tuber. They're more of a spring crop, but most of your root crops you can grow. And then there are peas, which if you're planting them right now, is a good time to plant them. You need to nurture them, and probably you need to protect them from the birds because they are a favored plant of birds. Okay, next slide. And this is Kitty's part. She's going to step in and talk to you about how can you manage the garden that you do plant so that you can save water and really optimize what you've planted. And thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kathy.
Mhm.
So my situation is almost the exact opposite of Kathy's situation. I live in Santa Rosa, and I have a typical lot from a mid-century house. So my garden is on a much smaller scale than Kathy's. Also, Kathy has a lot of things planted vegetable and fruit wise right into the soil, whereas I'm using raised beds for my veggies, and for my citrus trees, I have very large pots. So my Meyer lemon tree, my bear lime, and my mandarin are in very large pots instead of right in the soil. My blueberries, which I have not let go of yet, are in a large trough. So I have them in containers. I also have a strawberry tower that I created out of grow bags. And That is a very small footprint, but it is vertical. The rest of my garden is mostly habitat garden, a lot of natives. Over time, it's changed a lot. And primarily now I plant for pollinators and for habitat. So how do we save water? There's so many variables. As Kathy said, the difference is in what you do to your soil. So my native soil here in Santa Rosa and the Santa Rosa Plain in general is very heavy clay. I have lived here almost 20 years now and have put so many loads of compost on my soil that even the native soil of my habitat areas is pretty loamy by now, but that took a lot of amendment. So compost, as Mary Lou said, soil is alive. Compost is decomposing organic matter, and it is alive. It is based on microbes. When you add compost to your soil is capable of holding more water. In the case of clay, it is capable of allowing more water in. So in your raised bed or my raised bed, I have about 60% soil and 40% compost by now. And that's because I add compost every spring, I add compost every fall. And over time, the soil in my beds is significantly different than the soil of my native ground. And so it can hold more water and it needs more water. Sounds confusing. So my native clay soil, something that you would plant a native plant into and it would be quite happy, is holding a lot more water than my well-amended raised bed. What's the difference between compost and mulch? Not very much, except that mulch goes on top. Can you use compost as mulch? Yes, and I do. But you can also use mulch, other substances for mulch. In a vegetable garden, we want organic mulch. No plastic, no landscape cloth, no rocks. But you could use compost. You could use composted wood chips, often called arbor mulch. You could use rice straw. You could use rice hulls. You could use newspapers thickly applied. You could use untreated cardboard. So I have tried all of these things, and many master gardeners have found something that works well in their personal situation. So this photo shows you rice straw. I have been using rice straw for years. I recently became aware of a sustainability issue in using rice straw. I don't live next to a rice paddy. I don't grow any rice. All my rice straw comes from the feed store, which means it came from somewhere else. So in our attempt to become more sustainable, the closer to home your mulch comes from, the more sustainable it is. In other words, if you had bagged up leaves at the end of autumn and allowed them to compost, that's perfect mulch. It's from your own location. So try to keep it local and make sure that you use something that is not contaminated with weeds for your mulch. And the issue there is with horse feed, cow feed, those kinds of things. So if you're cleaning out stables, you have to be really concerned about composting your mulch. Next. Here's another tricky way to use the plants themselves as a mulch. So this is an example of a square foot garden. It has a 1 square foot grid on top of the planting bed. And this is an entire methodology for growing vegetables in particular. And people are very successful with it when they become really interested in it. So you can see each square foot is planted densely. So some squares have 2 plants, some squares have 12 plants, some squares may only have 1 broccoli plant, but lettuce grows thickly, onions grow thickly, carrots grow thickly. So if you want to try this method, you can find on the Master Gardener website the planting densities for different vegetables. What happens is, as the plants grow, they shade the soil and they create their own deterrent to evaporation. So if you have a spot where you want to try out the system, it can be very successful. Even if you don't have your grid, you can still think about planting in this kind of geometric form rather than in rows. So this allows you to grow many more vegetables in the same space that you would. Vegetables in rows are the least efficient way to grow vegetables. In my garden, my beds have 1/4 inch drip. And I place it about 8 to 12 inches apart. And my holes are 6 to 12 inches apart within the drip. And my goal is to cover the entire surface of the bed with water so that it's available to the plants that are planted like this. Next slide. All right, I just saw a great picture of newly planted starts in August covered with shade cloth. So shade cloth is usually a dark color. I have seen it in lighter colors. You can get it in different densities. So according to the density, it lets in more or less sunlight. It lets in water. So Kathy mentioned those famous blueberries. In the heat of the summer, my blueberries were getting too much sun, so I covered them with shade cloth because all the flowers had already been pollinated. But I wouldn't do that in the spring. The other thing that you can use when you're putting out new transplants is a row cover. Now, the difference between a row cover is that they are woven to prevent insects from getting in, and they are a pest control strategy. They also help the dew hang around longer. And there are certain row covers that are specifically for frost protection. So if you still have some of those delicate lettuces in your garden when the frost comes, usually Halloween to mid-November is our first frost, they may save you from having that mushy lettuce. And they will also encourage newly planted things to continue to grow. Now, what are some of the things you could put out under that shade cloth? So right now, Kathy mentioned a bunch of vegetables. One that she didn't mention was salad turnips. So this was the first year I planted salad turnips, and they are absolutely wonderful. They grow like a radish. They look like a white radish. They're little and round, and you eat them raw in salads. And those you could plant now, and you might even be able to succession plant them and get a couple of crops before the end of the season. Another thing is one of the last crops that you can plant, especially from seed, is spinach, because spinach, depending on the variety, can handle some chill. Next, please.
Kitty, it's 5 minutes.
Okie doke. So you remember the diagram that showed how much we overwater our plants. So, believing in science, I went out to my drip controller, and it's August. I turned down my drip. It's very counterintuitive. So we generally recommend 6 minutes a day of watering in your veggie gardens in raised beds. And that's with 1/2 inch controllers. It's about 1 inch of water a week. So I have to continue to check my soil. If it gets too dry, I'm going to have to supplement that watering. So how do you know how dry your soil is? Well, you can use your finger on the right, which is a tried and true method, especially for vegetables. They are not that deeply rooted, most of them. You want to know underneath the mulch that you've applied and into your well-composted soil, how much water is getting to the roots of the plant. Or you can use a chopstick, same thing, use it like a dipstick. Find out how much water is in your garden. I happen to like the method on the left, which is a little meter on the end of a metal prong, and you stick it into your pot or your bed, and it registers whether your soil is dry, just right, the Goldilocks system, or too wet, which can happen with watering. So when I ran out of space in my raised beds, I did put tomatoes into a pot. The thing about growing vegetables, tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, whatever it is in a pot, you have to watch them much more carefully than you do a bed. They can dry out in an afternoon. Next, please. Another point is you don't want to be watering weeds. You don't want them competing for the precious water. So if weeds should appear, you need to remove them. The most prevalent weed in my personal garden is oxalis, and it's a lovely little clover-like with a cheery flower, and it seems to come out of the blue and spread everywhere. So that's my weed to remove, and I can easily pull it out. When it's in the path where it is also using water, I can use a pointed hoe that cuts it off at the surface of the soil. So hairy fleabane, you may be familiar with this one. Cut leaf geranium, another cute little plant that just wants to grow. Or creeping spurge. This is very low growing and just looks sort of like bumpy stems. So all of these are draining your system and taking away from water. So I recently had a very sad experience. I got my water bill. I have been saving water in buckets. I have been rinsing vegetables with water into strainers. I have been carrying water everywhere. I've been testing for dryness. I've been using my drip system, and I used twice as much water as I was supposed to. So now it's time for me to cut back on my drip, continue collecting water for my vegetables. In terms of vegetables that you eat that grow above the ground or root crops, you don't want to use gray water on those. If you have an orchard or trees that still need to be irrigated, that's where the gray water goes. Even with biodegradable soaps, I don't think the containers of plants have enough soil connection to be 100% sure that you're not going to do some damage to your plants. So this is what we're looking at in terms of your vegetable garden. I encourage you to grow food. You can grow food, but it may look different than it has in the past. And the next slides have resources, our photo credits, and the next one, these are all good resources on the UCANR website, which you can access through the Master Gardeners Sonoma County website, all about how to water with less, how to grow veggies with less water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kitty, and also Kathy as well for the excellent information. We're going to take a quick 2-minute break, get up, stretch, get something to drink, and we'll be back in just 2 minutes. And for our last panelist, Mimi Enright, we'll wrap it all up talking about, continuing our topic of drought, landscaping in a drought, and also talking about Firewise practices. So see you in just a moment. My great opportunity to introduce Mimi Enright, who was born and raised in the Bay Area and spent many happy days as a child exploring the Santa Cruz Mountains. She worked in the technology industry for 17 years before moving to Sonoma County in 2000 to pursue her passion as a garden designer. She completed the training to become a UC Master Gardener in 2011, and due to her interest in helping educate Sonoma County residents on the topic of sustainable landscaping. Mimi completed a sustainable MBA with a concentration in food systems in 2014. She has been with the University of California Cooperative Extension, Sonoma County since 2013 in actually a dual role as the Master Gardener Program Coordinator and as Program Manager focusing on community-based food systems with particular focus on emergency food response and food recovery. Thank you for being here, Mimi.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Kim. So I'm going to try to build on the wonderful foundation of presentations you've heard from Cleo and Mary Lou and Kitty and Kathy. And I'm going to be sharing some basic information with you about defensible space and some opportunities you might want to consider for creating a more Firewise and sustainable landscape moving forward. And hopefully, I'm hoping to give you a framework for assessing your landscape, especially if you are prioritizing plant removal during the drought. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take you through some basic principles on fire and Firewise landscaping, then step you through some design recommendations by defensible space zone, touch briefly on mulch considerations. We are already having some questions in the Q&A about mulch use, and then wrap up with some opportunities for you to consider in marrying water conservation and defensible space recommendations moving ahead. So as Cleo so aptly presented to us in our introduction, we know this is what our future looks like. And with climate change, scientists are projecting more extremes in when we get rainfall, and when we get rain, it will likely be in atmospheric rivers. And when we don't, we will likely be having longer drought periods. We live in a summer dry climate anyways, which means that we have to provide irrigation for plants that aren't low or very low water use from generally April to October. So we really need to get smarter about how we capture water and retain it when we do get it, whether it's in the soil or in storage containers. Smarter about what plants we're using in our gardens from a water use and a biodiversity perspective. Smarter about where we put those plants from a Firewise perspective, and how we design the landscapes around our home. And I thought Kathy did a really great job speaking to the fact that each of our landscapes are unique. And we really have to consider each of our own situations individually, but hopefully I'm going to give you some ideas today that help you to move forward and be better prepared in the future. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on fire and how it operates, but I want to cover a few basics which are important to the context of what I'm presenting today. So fire must have three elements in order to burn, and that is fuel, oxygen, and heat. And fuel very basically is anything that will burn, right? So in our landscapes, that could be vegetation, trees, woody shrubs, landscape mulch, fencing, lawn furniture, or arbors attached to our home, or et cetera, et cetera. So which of these elements can you control? That's the fuel component. So there are three types of fire exposures that threaten our home landscapes and structures. The first is, I think, the one we're most classically familiar with, which is direct flame contact. But our structures can also be threatened by radiant heat from nearby burning items, such as in this example in the middle picture of a burning tool shed. But as we're all too painfully aware in Sonoma County, embers are also a significant threat to our structures. And traditionally, educational messages have really been mostly focused on that. How to reduce direct flame contact through defensible space, and preparing for embers takes a different approach, and we'll talk about a bit more about that later. So the majority of structure ignitions are associated with embers, and they can ignite building components and contents directly, or ignite vegetation and other combustible items adjacent to or near a building. So this can then result in that radiant heat or direct flame contact exposure that we just talked about. Embers have a way of finding a weakness in a home. And since most building ignitions have been attributed to embers, it's a particularly important aspect for us to be aware of as we work to prepare our homes and landscapes against future fires. So start trying to look at your landscape with a new lens for identifying any potential receptive fuel beds within your landscape. Look at where an ember would ignite organic materials and possibly transmit fire to your home. For example, embers may land on and ignite debris that is accumulated in your gutter, and that burning debris then causes direct flame contact on the edge of the roof. Or embers can ignite nearby woody vegetation that has dead debris built up in its interior, which could ignite and then result in a radiant heat exposure to the side of a building, and then potentially breaking the glass of a window or igniting combustible siding. So let's start with some key basic foundational recommendations to make your home landscape more firewise. You want to remove all dead or dying plants and branches, and remove any ladder fuels. And I'll talk a little bit more about ladder fuels in my next slide. The recommendation is to create islands of plantings with non-combustible paths between them to interrupt the path of the fire. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to all structures. And it's recommended that you prune tree limbs up at least 6 feet from the ground, or if you're dealing with a smaller tree, 1/3 of the tree height. Okay, hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of ladder fuels. The goal is to reduce the possibility of having fire move from the ground plane up into the crown of the trees. So you want to avoid planting shrubs under trees. If you do have shrubs under your trees, you want to make sure that there's at least 3 times the height of the shrub between it and the lowest tree limb. Again, we talked in the last slide about limbing up your tree limbs at least 6 feet from the ground. And really seriously considering, especially during the drought, if you are looking at your landscape with the lens to prioritizing some plant removal due to the reduced water available that we have and that we likely will have moving forward in our future. Great first opportunity to take is to remove any ladder fuels underneath your trees. Okay, so your starting point in creating defensible space is your house. And we're not going to go into the topic of home hardening today, as our focus is on the landscape, but there are really many wonderful resources to help guide you through the home hardening process. But here are the different defensible space zones in your home landscape that we'll be discussing today. So after you've hardened your home, you then want to move out to the 0 to 5 foot perimeter around your structures, then move to the 5 to 30 foot perimeter, and finally to 30 to 100 feet. Okay, so let's dive into these 3 defensible space zones. So the 0 to 5 feet from your structure, called the Ember Defense Zone, is really a relatively newer zone introduced into defensible space recommendations. When we first started doing a deep dive into this topic after the 2017 wildfires complex, we couldn't even find any graphics that depicted the 0 to 5 foot defensible space zone. That's how new this zone is in recommendations. But I want to stress that this zone is supported by scientific research. The objective of this zone is to reduce the chance of wind-blown embers from a fire landing near the home and igniting combustible debris or materials in that 0 to 5 foot perimeter. Since this zone is closest to the house, it really requires the most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. So classically, we have massed shrubs against the house, foundation shrubs. So this is a really big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. But we really need to think about the fuel that this generates for fire in immediate proximity to our house. So the recommendation is to minimize planting in this zone, most especially under vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, and under or near a deck. Optimally, you will have no combustible zones used in this zone, like plants and wood mulch. The ideal would be to use perhaps a decorative rock or hardscape to create your ember defense zone. And of course, you want to ensure that you're continuing to regularly remove any dead or dying plant materials, and that it is a county code requirement to prune all tree limbs within 10 feet of a chimney or stovepipe. So if you are reconsidering your landscape due to the drought, there is an opportunity to manage your landscape. So moving ahead, you're better prepared during this and future fire seasons. So that could mean removing all the plants in your 0 to 5 foot perimeter around structures. I want to stress that that doesn't mean you have to remove trees. Trees provide really important shade during the summer to reduce energy needs inside your home. The most important aspect to consider in tree placement in proximity to your home is the debris that they may drop, right? The leaves that they may drop that you then need to maintain on your roof and in the zones immediately around structures. So a lot of people, as I said, are really struggling with the idea of removing all the plant materials within the 5 feet perimeter around their homes. So I just wanted to share some ideas and some visuals in each of these zones to help perhaps give you some inspiration. There are a lot of creative ways to use hardscape in this zone that will prevent embers from igniting organic material and transmitting that fire to your home. So the use of decorative rock and boulders, perhaps a water feature, or permeable hardscape, right? So the water is infiltrated into the soil, such as gravel or a brick patio. Here's some visuals. These are, the picture on the left is from a structure that was sadly lost during the Tubbs fire. The owner has rebuilt, and you can see how they have a really nice, simple gravel pathway around the perimeter of the structure in that ember defense zone. And on the right, a picture from a property in Glen Ellen with some really creative use of some stone and some stepping stones. Okay, let's move on to the 5 to 30 foot defensible space zone called the home defense zone around your structures. This is commonly where firefighters will make a stand if they are working to defend your home from a wildfire. So you want to keep this in mind to ensure that they have ease of access in this zone. The recommendation in the 5 to 30 foot zone is to plant in islands that are separated by non-combustible pathways. The goal again is to interrupt that flow of fire to your home. And plantings in this zone should optimally be herbaceous or non-woody and in 3 feet in height or less. You can consider inclusion of a shrub or trees, but optimally it would be a specimen or single tree or shrub rather than masses. Again, you want to make sure that you've got access for regular maintenance, as you want to keep all plants clear of dead plant debris. And the recommendation is not to use wood mulch in this zone. Perhaps you can consider using compost as a mulch in this zone instead of wood mulch. And the 5 to 30 foot zone, especially with that close proximity to your house, is a great zone for hardscape, such as patios. So again, from a design perspective, in the 5 to 30 foot zone, you want to keep it low growing, mostly perennial, low fuel, really well maintained. Maintenance is a really critical aspect of our fire preparedness in our landscapes. Use rock mulch, possibly between your planting groups, to create that non-flammable separation between your plant materials. And again, great zone for hardscape. Here's another home that sadly was lost in the 2017 fires, but you can see they've done a really great job with mostly herbaceous plants. They've got a great 0 to 5 and even further than that out with a hardscape directly adjacent to the house. And around that, mostly herbaceous plants under 3 feet with a few specimen trees, and the planting area is separated by a gravel path. Some more island and path ideas. In this case, less expensive drain rock has been used. Permeable paths, again, allow for water infiltration into the soil. So it keeps the water on your property rather than running off into the street. Okay, and our final defensible space zone in the 30 to 100 foot or reduced fuel zone. We have the same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrubs and trees in widely spaced groups. You want to continue that focus on creating islands of vegetation that are separated by hardscape. And again, ensure that you have ease of access for maintenance. Wider pathways can facilitate that access. Continue your vigilance on ladder fill removal and regularly removing dead plant material. So use of wood mulch or leaving leaf litter is okay in this zone. All annual grasses should be mowed to 4 inches in height. And you want to move any wood piles to this zone so you don't have, and making sure you don't have anything combustible located near the pile. Some more pictures with some design ideas. This with use of some natives to support biodiversity with some separation between those plant groupings. In many urban landscapes, you may not have a 30 to 100 foot zone. In that scenario, you want to make sure you're working closely with your neighbors on preparedness. So these are CAL FIRE recommendations for plant spacing guidelines within 100 feet of your homes. And I want to stress a few things. These are not mandated by law, and these are not based on scientific research, but these are the best experience and recommendations from our firefighting personnel to share with us. So these guidelines for spacing are due to flame height and are based on the slope of the land around the home, which is a major consideration in assessing wildfire risk. I'm sure as we're all familiar, a fire will burn faster and more intensely moving uphill than along flat ground. So a steeper slope will result in a faster moving fire with longer flame lengths. So this graphic is depicting shrub spacing. Low growing or well irrigated grasses or ground covers or perennials are considered acceptable between these plant groupings or these islands. But again, each of us needs to assess our overall risk of our own individual property with the degree of slope and fire risk to make appropriate decisions on our planting. This graphic is depicting suggested horizontal tree spacing, as well as that vertical separation, the ladder fuels that we discussed earlier. So note again that 3 times the height of the shrub from the top of the shrub to the lowest tree branches. Spacing on less than a 20% slope of 10 feet is recommended. And on steeper slopes, the recommended distance is increased. So we don't have to denude our landscapes in the 100-foot perimeter around the home, but we do want to ensure that we have spacing to reduce the fuel volume and help break up the flow of fire to the house. A swale is a great way to break up planting areas. So as Mary Lou referenced, it's an excellent way to slow, spread, and sink and store water into our soil. So just another creative approach and idea to meet a number of needs in helping reduce fire risk and increase water retention in our soil. Okay, so mulch is a really important aspect of sustainable landscaping because it helps with weed suppression and is really important for water conservation. But since wood mulches are organic and as such combustible materials, which can transmit fire, it's recommended to not use mulch in a widespread or continuous manner. So again, the recommendation is for no organic mulch in the 0 to 5 foot zone. A couple of great examples of homes from the Fountain Grove area, rebuilds post 2017, and you can see where they've implemented some rock or gravel perimeters around the structures. I will point out that on a red flag warning day, for that picture on the left, you're going to want to be making sure that you're moving those chairs out of that 0 to 5 foot zone in preparation for possible fire. So you want to, if possible, separate your mulched areas with non-combustible and ignition resistant materials such as concrete, gravel, rock, or maybe a native grass lawn. Composted wood chips demonstrated the least hazardous fire behavior overall of 8 mulch treatments that were tested in a study by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California. And the recommendation is to use maximum a 2 to 3 inch deep application of wood mulch in your planted areas. The recommendation is to choose larger size arbor mulch, no gorilla hair. The smoldering combustion produced by gorilla hair may not be readily noticeable during a wildfire event and may go undetected by firefighters. So the picture on the left shows composted wood chips, and on the picture on the right, that's gorilla hair mulch. This is a picture from Fire Safe Marin, and you can see how the embers landed in the gorilla hair and can tend to smolder. So the risk is that firefighters may move on to defend another property, and the embers could flare up and then spread fire to the home. Some more visuals about possible ideas for breaking up planted areas. Alternative mulches include gravel and compost or plant cover, as was discussed by Kitty and Kathy. So again, use composted wood mulch in your 30 to 100 foot zone. Irrigated native grasses or ground covers can be considered appropriate for all zones if well maintained. And gravel and stone pathways and swales are great in all the different defensible space zones. Okay, so making the assumption that we get some rain this winter, and you're ready to replace some plants that maybe you lost this year due to the drought. What are the plant selection considerations that are also fire-wise? If you're rethinking your home landscape for greater fire resilience, we really encourage you to consider native plants. By incorporating native plants into your landscapes, you can help extend habitat for insects and wildlife. And many native plants are low and very low water use because they have adapted and evolved to our summer dry climate. So you want to choose plants that will grow to a size appropriate for their location. So when you pick up that little 4-inch pot with the plant at a nursery, you need to pay attention to what its mature size will be and where you're planning to put it in your landscape. So you want to make sure you're locating plants where excess pruning is not required to maintain desired spacing. Are you putting it somewhere where it will thrive? If it's a plant that prefers shade, are you putting it in full sun? And are you up for the maintenance that the plant will require? Is it invasive? Will it spread to a neighbor's property and possibly create a fire threat? And then we should also consider how a plant might change over its lifespan. And lavender is a great example. It's somewhat ubiquitously used in wine country landscapes. It starts out as herbaceous and becomes much more woody over time. So after being really deeply enmeshed in this topic, I've started to see a landscape through a different lens. And I really think about how fire will possibly move through the landscape around my home and how much fuel that would add to a fire. How much woody mass is there, for example? So with this lens last winter, I cut back some larger salvias that had become really, really woody. And they've grown back beautifully this last spring with more herbaceous stems with much less woody mass. But they will become woody again in a year or two, and I will cut them back again. So if you don't want to do this kind of ongoing maintenance, then appropriate plant selection for how a plant might change over time is an important consideration as well. Okay, this is a great East Bay mud graphic that shows before and after maintenance. And in the before picture, we have masses of shrubs against the house, continuous masses of shrub with no breaking up of planted areas, and ladder fuels. And in the after picture, we see islands of vegetation, shrubs next to the house removed, trees limbed up, and ladder fuels removed, and shrubs and trees thinned. So I know it can be hard to try to translate this information to an existing mature landscape, and just trying to help with some more framework that that might give you some considerations moving ahead. So again, just a quick recap of the different defensible space zones that we've talked about. In the 0 to 5 foot zone around your home, you want to use inorganic materials such as granite, gravel, or stepping stones. In the 5 to 30 foot zone, you want to plant in islands separated by hardscape and use plant materials such as low herbaceous perennials, grasses, or succulents. And specimen or individual shrubs or trees are optimal. And then in that 30 to 100 foot zone around your home, you want to use the same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrub and tree groupings in widely spaced groups, separated by areas that break up the spread of wildfire. So as I mentioned earlier, ongoing maintenance is really essential in maintaining a Firewise landscape. Throughout the year, you want to make sure you're removing dead or dying branches from trees or shrubs regularly. That's particularly poignant and of relevance for us during this significant drought. You want to make sure you're pruning out any dead material from the interior of shrubs if possible. And very important, you want to make sure you're removing any ladder fuels. We highly recommend that you prioritize removing any shrubs planted directly under trees. Okay, so here are some opportunities for you to consider as you work through prioritizing your landscape given water restrictions. You want to remove plants and wood mulch in the 0 to 5 foot zone and replace those with inorganic materials. When prioritizing plants given water restrictions, try to consider plant separation in those 5 to 30 foot and 30 to 100 foot zones. We recommend that you consider use of compost as mulch in the 5 to 30 foot zone and separate any mulched plant islands with hardscape or low ground cover. And we've got lots of resources for you on our webpage. And if you have any questions, you're always welcome to send an email to our information desk at mgsonoma@ucnr.edu.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Kind of a fact-packed, information-packed afternoon. As Cleo said when she kicked us off, there's a lot of changes in our world, in our gardens, but there's also so many things that we can do. And hopefully today has offered you lots of suggestions on landscape planting, irrigation considerations. We've had lots and lots of questions about mulch. What is, what isn't, where should it go? Chips or bark, or yes or no, so hopefully. And then, food gardening, is so important to so many people, and how you can also do and enjoy food gardening with water-wise principles in mind. And of course, how do we do all of this with a lens towards Firewise practices? We've learned so much as a community about that there really are so many things we can do. And Mimi had some beautiful photographs of some, new ways of gardening that really are just as lovely. attract pollinators, attract native birds and animals, and yet are also really thinking ahead and thinking about our current climate and what our homes really, can and should be. So with that, there's a couple more questions. We've answered a lot of the questions in the, as we've been going along, but there's a couple that are outstanding. Maybe I'll put to the group. One was about, I think this is maybe for Kitty and Kathy, about a community garden and the idea of how much, water should you, provide to a community garden. And in their particular case, they've zeroed in on providing 1 inch of water per day. But they do, as was mentioned, have a meter on the line, which is fantastic, in terms of being able to, gauge how much water is being applied. So I don't know if that might be something that you could offer some thoughts on.
As the famous person once said, it depends. So 1 inch of water over what area? So 1 inch of water in my vegetable garden per week equals 6 minutes with 1/2 inch emitters. So I need to know a lot more before I could say. I would say use the finger test. Is it too dry? Notice your plants. Do you have yellowing leaves? Then you have to figure out yellowing leaves from too much water or too little water. And how is the water dispersed? So is it in a community garden? My experience is you can't have a controller. You have to physically go and turn on a watering system and only operate it while you're there in the ones that I've been involved with. So how long are they leaving the watering on? I know at Bear, that was one of our biggest problems. Even when we were there 2 times a week, that was insufficient watering time often to maintain the hottest days of the year when plants needed a lot of water. So sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is a lot of, it depends, because everyone's circumstance is so unique. So, and hopefully this presentation has offered some really important tools for zeroing in on what makes sense for you and your situation. Mary Lou, maybe, one for you about this notion of water pressure, because you mentioned that in a couple of places, for example, when you're using soaker hoses, how do you make sure you have enough pressure? But it's also possible to have too much pressure. There's kind of a sweet spot, if you will, in terms of how much pressure and, how do you establish pressure and maintain a pressure to have effective irrigation?
Well, the pressure that comes into our houses from the city or from a well, perhaps, it is usually higher than 20 or 30 pounds per square inch, PSI. And sometimes when you're in a city, I know in Santa Rosa that on the fire hydrants, the pressure is often written for the firefighter's knowledge on the hydrant. So check out the nearest hydrant that's near you and see what kind of pressure is coming from that into your home and then out into your garden. So when you're using sprinklers, they spew water everywhere and they don't care what kind of pressure they have. And when you're using drip, this has little holes, and a soaker hose has even smaller little pinprick holes. So if you overwhelm that drip irrigation with high pressure water, you might pop your emitters. You just won't get the kind of watering that you want to get. It just is too overwhelming for it. So you have to put a pressure reducer, very simple to do. If you have valves, then it has to go on a valve. If you are using a hose and you are hooking it to a soaker hose, then you need a water pressure reducer on that hose.
Thank you. One that I think was answered in the chat, but I'm going to ask Mimi anyway, about, you mentioned the challenges of lavender, the ever popular lavender, and, just kind of off the top of your head, what would be some alternatives to lavender?
Well, I know Cleo knows what answer I'm going to give.
But she actually did in the chat.
I have a beloved native plant that really, I think has a lot of similar characteristics to lavender. It's evergreen. It stays in a smaller, nice, compact shape. You can shear it throughout the year really easily. It pops right back for rebloom. Has a beautiful, highly scented purple flower, and it's Verbena lilacina de lamina. I don't know the common name on it actually, but how can you resist such a beautiful botanical name? I think it's native to maybe the Catalina Islands in off of the Santa Barbara coast, but it grows really well here in Sonoma County. It's thriving for me in my hot garden in Cloverdale. So I highly recommend it. I do have a fellow master gardener who grew it in Sebastopol, had to treat it more like an annual because she had really hard frosts at her property and she would lose it to freeze, but it's never been an issue for me. But I highly recommend that. Yes, Leslie, I will repeat that. I'll type it into the chat too. It's just a wonderful native plant alternative. And, there's so many kind of great options we have from our native plants that support biodiversity. It's low water use, and it's such an important thing for us to consider. So it's verbena, or Verbena, lilacina, kind of like lilac with INA on the end. And it's de la mina. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Cleo's giving you the link. But I'd say that would make an excellent alternative to landscape in our home gardens.
But one little caveat there.
Yeah.
Is that it is a beautiful plant. It's wonderful. I planted it and the deer ate it. So that is a problem for some people, such as myself. So.
And yes, absolutely. Pollinators love the Verbena lilacina.
Yeah.
But Mary Lou, you pride yourself on being a habitat gardener.
I do. I gave it to them and they ate it.
Yeah, and sometimes the deer are the local habitat, right?
Yes, they are.
Mary Lou, do you have any other suggestions for alternatives to lavender?
Well, nothing as Nepeta is a good little
that's
one
another
there.
wonderful one.
Nepeta, and I also like Teucrium chamedris. Those are wonderful perennials or small shrubs that will stay with you and deer will not eat them.
And easily maintained. You can share all of those back for
Yes,
fire maintenance, for
Yep.
rebloom. Those are all easy peasy perennials.
Yes.
Yeah, I think on our webpage, we will give you the link of the best plants that do in the natives particularly, and the non-natives as well. We could share that link with you. Kim, did you want to bring up the question? I think that was an important one on the colored mulch.
Decorative mulch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bark.
Right.
One of the things that we learned, Mimi, and you probably remember better, was that the dark colored mulches are the ones that are painted dark colors are not very good because they heat up your soil. So you will need more water. So the lighter the wood chips and the lighter the color, even in the areas where you're using rocks, if you use the lighter colored rocks, that's way better for the keeping the heat. Is that right, Mimi?
Yeah, that's what we've been hearing from experts just lately, actually. I'm actually going to try an experiment in hot Cloverdale this fall. I'm going to try a gravel mulch in a bed that's in my 5 to 30 foot zone. And, if it works, how happy am I? And if it doesn't, I'll lose a few plants, but I think these are the kind of experiments that we're all going to be trying to be better prepared as we move forward. I live in a high fire severity zone adjacent to wildland urban interface, so I need to be paying attention very closely to all the recommendations in the defensible space zone.
Someone mentioned growing Leonotis, and that is a wonderful choice. Deer do not eat it. It's a great pollinator plant. It's striking, and it's from South Africa. And I recommend that as well. But it does get woody, and you have to cut it to the ground every few years.
I did that on your advice, and it's blooming this year way better. Thank you, Mary Lou.
You're welcome.
Maybe one other question is, we grow, close in time, is just about, we've mentioned a couple of times about trees, kind of prioritizing trees, even when we're all needing to cut back water, the benefit of trees. Somebody asked specifically, is the concept, the exact quote is the concept of trees shading our house a dead issue?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. So, maybe just a couple comments about that.
Yeah. And I really try to stress that in my presentation, but I was doing a speed version of what's normally a longer presentation for you guys. But trees provide a wide array of really important services and ecosystem services. And energy conservation for our homes is one of those that's really important amongst, a myriad of other, whether it's, urban heat island reduction, especially with, anticipated increased temperatures due to climate change, also a super important consideration. Biodiversity support, especially if they're native. So we really try to stress, we're not saying in that 0 to 100 feet that you have to remove all your trees, especially if you have a tree in your 0 to 5 foot zone. I have, an oak that's in very close proximity to my home in the 5 to 30. Gorgeous mature oak tree, which many of us have and are blessed to have in our gardens. But it does mean that you have to be much more vigilant about maintenance. So I'm on those red flag warning days, I'm out there removing any leaves and that oak tree is dropping leaves year round in that 0 to 5 foot zone. It meant I spent a lot of time this spring reducing the really, really thick leaf litter of those oaks in the 5 to 30 foot zone. So absolutely not saying the value of trees is not critically important. It is, and they are, and it is the thing that we recommend the most that you prioritize if you are on significant water restrictions and saving them, because they provide so many amazing services and so much joy in our lives, really, quite frankly, and are not as easily readily replaced as a perennial, which will grow in a couple of years as compared to a tree, which takes decades. So it's just really about the lens of balancing, of understanding the considerations of what you need to do, and then maintaining them in optimal health, thinning them, right, limbing them up, and then just continuing real vigilance around maintenance.
Thank you very much. And
Kim, there was a number of questions on the flammability of specific plants, and I wanted Mimi to reinforce the notion of, and they were in the chat area. So.
Yeah, and sorry, I was while I was doing the presentation, I thought, oh, I should have included my plant flammability slide, but you had to pair out, right, for time considerations. So there is no scientific consensus on the specific characteristics that make one plant more flammable than others. There are kind of generally accepted aspects, such as maybe more resinous, but any plant will burn under the right conditions, and I think we've seen that all too closely and intimately here in Sonoma County. What's much more important is to consider the plant placement and the design of your garden. And that's why we really focus our recommendations on your design considerations within each of those zones of defensible space around your home. And then the other really critical aspect is ongoing maintenance. So for example, perfect example, I was visiting my brother and sister-in-law outside Grass Valley a couple months ago, and they had these massively overgrown Elaeagnus shrubs, tons of dead woody debris built up in the interior of the shrubs over years of growth, right directly under some oak trees, within about 10 feet of a structure. I was absolutely recommending that they needed to remove those shrubs, but it's really it's bringing that different lens of, I could look at that plant and see all that dead woody debris, let alone that it was a ladder field, but that dead woody debris that was built up in there, and know that that was a significant fire risk in proximity to a structure. So it's really about bringing a different lens of how you look at your plants. And maybe it's not only that design and placement, but then it's also about that ongoing maintenance. It's really, really, really critical as we move forward.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for just, all of the presentations and just the wealth of information just a couple of housekeeping things. We wanted to mention, as we've mentioned a couple of times, this was recorded. So you'll have an opportunity to view it again if you so choose. There's also information on the Master Gardener website, our Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram. And then, again, this presentation will be on our YouTube channel, as are a number of other presentations that you might find informative and helpful. In terms of upcoming events, that's something else you can find on our webpage. There's Veggie Happenings, which is going on actually tomorrow. So if you'd like to tune in for that. We also can answer one-on-one questions through our information desks. And then, here's the direct link to the calendar, or you can also put to click on the QR code for those of you who are comfortable with that technology. It'll take you right there. Master Gardeners, we're a not-for-profit organization. We're all volunteers. So if you want to know, would be interested in supporting that mission, here's information about that. And then, with that, we'd like to thank you for being here. Again, stay tuned for other upcoming presentations, and also thank you for considering drought considerations in your own gardens.